It seems like a common occurrence in history for a nation to be governed by a small group of Londoning men or bureaucrats. But what is relatively uncommon is that these men have a completely different culture and language from the vast majority of their subjects. This was obviously the case in most large multi-ethnic empires, but those states frequently had a heartland where the aristocracy and common people shared the same cultural identity. About today is something completely different from historical, political entities in which the governing elite was exclusively from a different ethnic background than their citizens. The European steppe tribes were one of the Iatas. This region would be dominated by various groups who migrated into Europe from their homeland in Central Asia, starting in the 4th century. This process began with the migration of the Huns and the subsequent establishment of their empire. It is here that an intriguing tendency common to many nomadic empires would first emerge. The Huns were merely a tiny drop in the river of people that they came to rule, acting essentially as they were an ability that extracted tribute from their several topics. Another example of this extreme situation was the other cognate, where 100 years after the fall of the Ghanaic Empire, a small group of tens of thousands of nomads, known as the Others, fled the encroaching Turkish cognate empire under the leadership of Bayan. The Ava people would eventually conquer a large territory by joining forces with the Lombardians to defeat the Germanic Gepids, and after the latter moved to Italy, the Others would take over their territory as well. As a result, this small group of Central Asian tribes established a base in the Pannonian Basin and came to dominate a vast region that was home to millions of slave Germanic and other nomadic groups. The Others would use the Great Division among the local native populations to subjugate them. Over the next few decades, these nomads would embark on multiple raiding expeditions into the Eastern Roman Empire, reaching as far as the city of the Avars. Hold on their subjects would gradually start to loosen after the Sonic, and even laid a failed siege on Constantinople, along with the Sassanid Empire in 626. Local Slavic tribes would frequently rebel against the unfair treatment they received from their nomadic overlords, while other groups, most notably the Bogus, would gradually start to secede from other control. The death blow for the Pannonian nomads would come in the 790s, after a devastating campaign in the land led by Charles the Great would effectively reduce the Ava Khaganate to a rump state, which the Bulgarian Empire would capture 10 years later. Next on our list is the ancestor of the Eastern Slavic states, the Kievan Rus. Surprisingly, the North settlers in the area were also known as Varangians by the locals, and the majority of the Viking raiders from Norway and Denmark swung southwest, while the ones from Sweden turned eastward and sailed along the Baltic Sea. Eventually navigating these subject people would eventually rebel and expel their Varangian brewers. But without the strong unifying crew of the North, the local Slavs would be quick to take arms against one another in an attempt to escape the vast disunity and uncertainty the Slavs faced. The fierce warriors of Scandinavia swiftly came to dominate the large rivers of Eastern Europe and even entered the Black Sea, despite being vastly outnumbered by those groups according to the foundation myth of Kievan Rus. In the end, a northern nobleman named Rurik would consolidate his rule over the major city of Novgorod in northern Russia. He would then expand southward, conquering the trade city of Kiev, which would eventually become the capital of his state. Thus, the Kievan Rus was founded. The northern ruling elite of the region would be quick to adopt the local customs and language, probably by the rule of Prince Viator Suave in the 10th century. The Ruriks and other northern aristocrats looked more like their slave subjects than their Scandinavian relatives in the century. A few centuries ago, many of the Germanic kingdoms established in the location of the Western Roman Empire were ruled by a small minority of people. The last remnants of Noah's culture would fade with the Christianization of the rules under Vladimir the Great in the early 11th century, but the ancestors of Rurik would continue to rule Russia until the 16th century. For instance, Germanic aristocrats ruled over millions of primarily Latin-speaking people in Visigothic Spain, Vandal Africa, and Ostrogothic Italy, where there were thousands of genuine Guelphs and Vandals. A large portion of the Lentoni aristocracy was still of Roman stock in order to travel to Italy, even though the nobility in these kingdoms wasn't exclusively Germanic. For instance, the power structures in Sicily and the southern portions of the peninsula had hardly changed since the Roman era, but the Gothic elites frequently had the new Gothic masters of Italy and Spain frequently attempted to emulate the Roman Empire, maintaining its political and cultural structures and even asserting that they were its legitimate successors, much to the chagrin of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which was still in existence. Unfortunately, Ostrogothic Italy did not survive long enough to witness the planning of its Roman and Gothic identities as the Italian peninsula was reclaimed by. The situation was similar in the Wando Kingdom of North Africa, which had actively worked to preserve its Germanic identity and Aryan beliefs, often even forcing them on its Roman subjects. But it was different in Zygotic Spain and Frankish-controlled Go, where the ruling Germanic elite swiftly adopted the Roman subjects' culture, language, and Catholic beliefs. The Romans were overrun by another Germanic people, the Lombards, in the 6th century. Fascinatingly, the Latin-speaking people in France and Spain would eventually take on the ethnonym of their Germanic and Gothic masters. This also happened with the rules we discussed, Bryant, even with my own people, but that is a subject for another video. Once more, I would like to express my gratitude to my patrons and to everyone who stayed until the very end. That's all I have to say, and I'll see you in the next video. You